Crimson droplets formed a path leading directly to his drinking well. After spending 37 years working this harsh, unforgiving ranch, Tobias Hartwell could easily distinguish between animal blood and human blood. Following these red traces around his barn's edge, he discovered something that made him grip his weapon tighter. Collapsed beside the stone well sat a young native warrior, clutching a severe wound on his torso while desperately stretching toward the water bucket. Suspended just beyond his reach, his labored breathing revealed his agony, yet his keen eyes followed Tobias's movements with the wariness of someone anticipating danger from all sides. The year was 1847, a time when discovering a Native American on your land spelled inevitable disaster, the sort of catastrophe that ended with settlers murdered in their beds or homesteads reduced to ashes. Any rancher from miles around would give Tobias identical advice. End the savage's life with a single shot and dispose of the evidence, where it would never surface. Tobias lifted his weapon, finger poised on the trigger. The logical choice, the cautious choice, the anticipated choice. Yet something in those penetrating eyes gave him pause. Beyond the physical suffering, he recognized a familiar desperation, the same overwhelming thirst he'd experienced during the devastating drought of '44 when 3 waterless days nearly claimed his life. The universal human craving that ignored race tongue or battlefield allegiances. The warrior attempted speech through cracked, bloodied lips, managing only a faint whisper. Water? Tobias set down his rifle and grasped the bucket. His fellow ranchers would brand him insane. His distant brother would claim frontier isolation had destroyed his judgment. Perhaps they'd prove correct. But kneeling beside this injured stranger and holding the wooden rim to parched lips, watching him consume water like someone rescued from drowning, Tobias understood one undeniable truth. This moment would transform both their destinies permanently. What Tobias couldn't foresee was that this wounded fighter held significant importance among the regional tribes. The events about to unfold would draw more horsemen to his property than he'd witnessed in his lifetime. The native drank with the urgency of someone who'd been without water for days, emptying 3 complete buckets before his shaking hands steadied enough to grip the rim. Tobias observed each swallow while his thoughts raced with the consequences of his actions. In this territory, showing kindness to a Native American equaled signing your execution order. As color gradually returned to the warrior's complexion, Tobias noticed something chilling. The gash wasn't from a wild animal or hunting mishap, it was a gunshot wound, recent and still bleeding. The trajectory and powder residue indicated close-range fire. Very recent, very close. Someone had attempted murder and might still be pursuing their target, potentially following the same blood trail leading straight to Tobias's ranch, possibly approaching at this very moment with loaded weapons and questions Tobias couldn't possibly answer. The native sensed his alarm. Summoning tremendous effort, he pointed toward the distant horizon, then drew his hand across his throat. His warning was unmistakable. Imminent danger approached. Tobias felt his pulse thundering. Every survival instinct demanded he remove this wounded stranger from his property immediately. Eliminate the proof. Act as though nothing had occurred. But the man could barely remain upright, let alone walk. Moving him would likely prove fatal. Leaving him here painted, targets on both their backs, then Tobias detected the sound that had preserved his life through 12 years of frontier existence, approaching hoofbeats. Multiple horses advancing rapidly, heading directly for his ranch. The native heard them too. Terror flashed across his features as he attempted to press himself against the well, as if becoming smaller might render him invisible. Blood immediately seeped between his fingers where he held his wound. Tobias seized the empty bucket and frantically washed away the blood trail, but time ran short. The riders would arrive momentarily. He gazed down at the wounded warrior, this stranger who'd stumbled into his existence and overturned it within a single afternoon. A man whose presence could doom them both, yet whose dark eyes held something Tobias had never before seen in a Native American. Genuine appreciation, pure human thankfulness. The hoofbeats intensified. close enough to count 5, perhaps 6 horses, all galloping with urgency that suggested hostile intentions. Tobias made his decision in that instant, knowing it might be his final choice. He couldn't carry the injured man, but concealment remained possible in the old root cellar behind the barn. If they could reach it, but as he bent to assist the native to his feet, the warrior seized his wrist with unexpected strength and slowly shook his head. Then he did something that made Tobias's blood freeze. He smiled. Not the grateful expression of someone being rescued, but the knowing look of someone who understood exactly who was cresting that hill. The horsemen appeared like an approaching storm. 6 mounted men with dust clouds trailing behind them, rifles gleaming in the afternoon light. Tobias immediately recognized the leader, Marshal Dixon Webb, whose violent reputation reached every settlement from here to Santa Fe. Webb represented the type of lawman who fired first and investigated later, particularly regarding native troubles. The kind who collected scalps as souvenirs and called it justice. The kind who would incinerate a ranch and its inhabitants if he suspected them of sheltering fugitives. Tobias positioned himself before the well, blocking the native from view, attempting to appear like someone with nothing more urgent than repairing fence posts. His mouth felt parched as desert sand. Webb halted his mount 10 feet away, close enough for Tobias to observe the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. The remaining 5 men formed a semicircle, hands positioned near their weapons. This wasn't a friendly visit. "Afternoon, Hartwell," Webb said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone holding all the power. "We're pursuing a wounded native. Blood trail leads directly to your property." Tobias felt perspiration forming despite the cool evening air. "Haven't encountered any natives, Marshal." "Been working the south fence all day?" Webb's gaze swept the ranch, missing nothing. His attention lingered on the dark stains near the well, and Tobias felt his stomach plummet. "Is that right?" Webb dismounted slowly, deliberately. "Because that certainly appears to be blood, fresh blood. Unless you've been slaughtering cattle. Beside your drinking water, I'd say someone visited recently." Behind Tobias, hidden by the stone well wall, the wounded native remained motionless. But Tobias could sense the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. One sound, one movement, and death would claim them both. Webb advanced 3 steps, his hand now openly resting on his pistol. "You understand the penalty for harboring native fugitives, don't you, Hartwell? It's identical to the penalty for treason, a noose around the neck until death." The words hung like a death sentence. Tobias felt every muscle coiled tight, prepared to fight or flee, knowing neither option offered salvation. Webb had approached too close. Any sudden movement would reveal the native, and bullets would follow. Then something impossible occurred. The wounded native spoke not in English, but in his native language, words flowing like music, clear and powerful despite his injuries. Words that froze Marshal Webb mid-stride and drained color from his face like water from a shattered bucket. Webb's hand dropped from his weapon. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged barely above a whisper. "Dear God, you're him." The other 5 riders immediately dismounted, their weapons forgotten, faces displaying shock mixed with something resembling fear. Not the fear men show facing enemies, but the fear of those realizing they've made a catastrophic mistake. Webb turned to Tobias, his face now winter pale. "Do you comprehend who you've been assisting?" Tobias stared at Marshal. Webb's terrified expression, his thoughts spinning wildly. In 12 frontier years, he'd never witnessed the ruthless lawmen show fear of anything not outlaws. Wild beasts, not even Apache war parties that had reduced 3 settlements to ash the previous summer. But Webb now looked like someone who'd encountered a specter. The wounded native spoke again, this time in flawless English, his voice carrying authority that seemed to encompass the entire ranch. "Tell him my identity, Marshal. Explain why you rode so desperately to locate me." Webb's throat worked as he swallowed hard. When words finally came, his voice cracked like an adolescent's. "This is Ayana, son of Chief Takakota of the Northern Apache. He's the one who negotiated the peace accord with Fort Richardson last spring." Tobias felt reality shifting beneath him. The peace accord, the same agreement that ended 3 years of savage warfare between settlers and Apache. The same treaty that preserved hundreds of lives on both sides, making it safe for families to establish homes in this territory without fearing midnight attacks. And he'd been giving water to the man who'd made it all possible. But if Ayana was a peacemaker, why was he fleeing from the law with a bullet wound? There was an ambush, Ayana continued, his breathing labored but voice strengthening. 3 days ago, a meeting with Colonel Morrison about extending the treaty to include southern territories. But Morrison had different intentions. Webb's complexion shifted from pale to gray. Colonel Morrison died, shot in the back during a native attack 3 days ago. You're wanted for his murder. That's precisely what they want you to believe, Ayana said, pushing himself straighter against the well. Morrison wasn't killed by natives. He was murdered by men wearing war paint, speaking just enough Apache to deceive witnesses. Men who knew exactly when and where we'd meet. The implications struck Tobias like a physical blow. Someone had orchestrated Morrison's murder to frame Ayana. Someone wanting the peace treaty destroyed. Someone wanting the territory to burn again. Who? Webb demanded, though his expression suggested he already suspected. Ayana's dark eyes hardened. Like stone, the same men selling weapons to renegade tribes. The same men profiting from this war. The same men who sent you hunting me instead of seeking the real killers. Webb stepped backward, his hand moving unconsciously toward his weapon before stopping. You're discussing treason, corruption, and territorial government? Those are serious charges, which is why they need me dead before I reach the Apache Council tomorrow, Ayana replied. Why they shot me and left me for dead. Why they're depending on men like you to complete what they started. Tobias watched this exchange with mounting dread. He'd thought he was simply helping a wounded stranger. Instead, he'd stumbled into a conspiracy that could tear the entire territory apart. But what chilled him most was realizing that if Ayana spoke truth, then Marshal Webb hadn't come to arrest a fugitive, he'd come to commit murder. Silence stretched like a rope about to snap. Webb's 5 men shifted nervously in their saddles, hands hovering near weapons, eyes moving between their marshal and the wounded Apache, who just accused half the territorial government of murder and treason. Tobias could see the internal battle raging behind Webb's eyes. The marshal was trapped between duty and truth, between orders and conscience. Men like Webb typically resolved moral dilemmas with bullets. Even if your claims are accurate, Webb said slowly, I have my orders. You're wanted for Morrison's murder. I'm supposed to bring you back dead or alive. Dead would be more convenient, Ayana replied, his voice steady despite pain etched across his features. Dead men can't testify. Dead men can't reveal who truly benefits from another native. War, one of Webb's men, a young deputy with nervous eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. Marshal, if he's telling the truth about the peace treaty ... Silence, Bradley, Webb snapped. But Tobias could see doubt creeping into the marshal's expression like cracks in a damn wall. That's when Ayana played his final card, reaching into a leather pouch at his belt with trembling fingers. He produced a folded paper stained with blood. This is why they attempted to kill me. A letter from Colonel Morrison, written the night before he died. Webb stared at the letter as if it might burst into flames. What does it contain? It reveals Morrison's discovery of who's been supplying weapons to renegade tribes. Names, dates, amounts, evidence sufficient to hang a dozen men. Ayana's eyes never left Webb's face, including proof that someone in the territorial marshal's office has been accepting bribes to look away. The words hit Webb like a physical blow. His face cycled through several shades of pale before settling on sickly green. Behind him, his men exchanged nervous glances, suddenly very interested in examining their horses' manes. Tobias felt his heart hammering. He was witnessing something that could get them all killed, the moment when a corrupt lawman realized his own neck was on the chopping block. You're lying, Webb said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Ayana held up the letter. Morrison trusted me enough to give me this the night he died. Told me to deliver it to Fort Richardson if anything happened to him. Said it was insurance. Webb stepped forward, his hand now gripping his pistol. Give me that letter, so you can destroy it. Ayana shook his head. I don't think so, Marshal. But I'll make you an offer. Let me live long enough to reach the Apache Council tomorrow, and I'll ensure your name isn't mentioned when this comes to light. The proposal hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Tobias could see Webb calculating odds, weighing risks, trying to determine which choice would keep him alive longer, but what happened next surprised everyone. Deputy Bradley dismounted and walked slowly toward the well, his hands raised peacefully. Marshal, I've been thinking about something. Remember that rifle shipment that disappeared 3 months ago? The one we were told was stolen by natives? Webb's face darkened. What about it? I saw those same rifles 2 weeks later in Settlers. Hands heading south. Bradley's young face flushed with either courage or fear. Made me wonder who was really stealing from whom. The admission cracked something open in the group. Suddenly, other deputies were nodding, sharing glances, remembering things that hadn't made sense at the time. Tobias realized that Ayana had just accomplished something remarkable. Without firing a shot or raising his voice, he'd turned Webb's own men against him, but Webb wasn't the type of man who surrendered without a fight. And when cornered, dangerous men did dangerous things. Webb's grip tightened on his pistol until his knuckles whitened. A cornered animal was always most dangerous. And Tobias could see the exact moment when the marshal decided that bullets were simpler than truth. You're all fools, Webb snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping. You think this savage's word means anything against mine? You think anyone will believe the testimony of a dead native and a handful of traitors? The deputies spread out, instinctively, hands moving toward their weapons, but Tobias could see uncertainty in their faces. Years of following orders warred against the growing realization that those orders might be wrong. Ayana struggled to his feet, using the stone well for support. Blood seeped through his fingers where he pressed them against his wound, but his voice remained steady. Truth doesn't care who speaks it, Marshal. It simply exists. The truth, Webb spat, is that you murdered a United States Army officer, and I'm going to collect the bounty on your head. He drew his pistol in one smooth motion, the barrel swinging toward Ayana. Before he could fire, Deputy Bradley stepped directly into the line of fire, his own weapon raised. Stand down, Marshal. The words cracked like thunder across the ranch. 4 other deputies followed Bradley's lead, their guns trained on their own commanding officer. Only one man remained. Loyal to Webb, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins, who looked as corrupt as his boss. You're making a mistake, boys, Webb said, sweat now beading on his forehead. A mistake that'll cost you your badges. Maybe your lives. Maybe, Bradley replied. But I've made enough mistakes following your orders, I won't make any more. Tobias watched this standoff with growing dread. 6 armed men in his ranch yard, all pointing guns at each other, all convinced they were right. This was how range wars started. This was how good men died for bad reasons. That's when I did something unexpected. He began to sing, not in English, but in Apache, a low, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The ancient words carried across the ranch like wind through canyon walls, speaking of honor and sacrifice, of brothers who stood together against darkness. The effect was immediate and startling. The deputies lowered their weapons slightly, not understanding the words but feeling their power. Even Webb seemed momentarily mesmerized by the sound, and while they listened, transfixed, Ayana was doing something else entirely. He was calling to his people. The song was a signal, a message carried on the evening wind to ears that knew how to listen. Tobias realized this with a chill that ran down his spine like ice water. Ayana wasn't just singing. He was summoning. The melody ended and silence fell over the ranch like a heavy blanket. But in that silence, Tobias heard something that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats, distant but growing closer. Many hoofbeats moving fast. Webb heard them too. His face went pale as moonlight. How many? Ayana smiled despite his pain. Enough. The sound grew louder, multiplying until it resembled thunder rolling across the plains. Not 6 riders this time. Not even a dozen. An entire Apache war party was riding toward Tobias's ranch, and they would arrive within minutes, Webb raised his pistol again, this time pointing it directly at Tobias's chest. You did this, you helped him signal them. I gave a dying man water, Tobias replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Same as I'd do for any suffering creature. On my land. The hoofbeats were close enough now to feel in the ground beneath their feet, close enough to count. Too many to count. And Webb finally understood what Ayanna had been planning all along. They appeared over the horizon like a vision from another. World 50 Apache warriors on horseback moving in perfect formation, their war paint gleaming in the dying sunlight. But as they drew closer, Tobias realized something that defied everything he thought he knew about native war parties. They weren't coming for battle. At the head of the group rode an elderly chief, whose presence commanded respect from 100 yards away. His gray hair was braided with eagle feathers, and despite his age, he sat his horse with the dignity of a man who had never bowed to anyone. Behind him rode warriors of every age, from seasoned fighters to young braves barely old enough to carry weapons, but their weapons remained sheathed. Webb's face cycled through confusion, fear, and desperate calculation. He still held his pistol trained on Tobias, but his hand shook like a man with fever. This changes nothing. I still have my orders. Your orders, came a new voice, are no longer valid. Everyone turned to see Deputy Bradley holding up an official-looking document. This came through this morning, Marshal, direct from the territorial governor. All pursuit of Ayanna is suspended pending investigation into Colonel Morrison's death. Webb's face went purple with rage. You lying piece of... Check your own dispatch pouch, Bradley interrupted. Unless you've been too busy collecting bounties to read your official mail. The Apache riders formed a wide circle around the ranch, not threatening, but unmistakably present. Their chief dismounted and walked slowly toward the well where his son waited. With each step, the old man's eyes never left Ayanna's face, searching for signs of serious injury. When father and son embraced, a collective sigh seemed to rise from the assembled warriors. Tobias found himself witnessing something sacred. The reunion of a leader with his people, a father with his child, a peace negotiator with those he'd sworn to protect. The chief spoke to his son in rapid Apache, his weathered hands checking the wound, his face grave with concern. Ayanna responded in the same language, but Tobias caught enough English mixed in to understand the gist, the truth, the conspiracy, the names of the real killers. When the conversation ended, the chief turned to face Webb with eyes like black diamonds. When he spoke, his English was perfect and precise. Marshal Webb, my son tells me you came here to murder him. Webb's pistol wavered. I came here to arrest a fugitive. A fugitive from your own corruption, the chief replied. A man whose only crime was discovering how you and your friends have been profiting from war between our peoples. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Webb's remaining ally, Hawkins, was slowly backing his horse away from the circle, clearly calculating his chances of escape. You have no proof, Webb said, but his voice cracked on the words. The chief smiled not warmly, but with the satisfaction of a man holding all the cards. We have Morrison's letter. We have the testimony of the real killers who confessed everything before they died trying to escape our justice. And we have something else. He gestured to one of his warriors who rode forward carrying a leather satchel. From it, the warrior produced a stack of papers that made Webb's face go ashen. Your correspondence with the gun runners, the chief continued. Every payment, every shipment, every lie you told to cover your tracks. Morrison was more thorough than you knew. Webb's world collapsed in that moment. Tobias watched a corrupt man realized that all his schemes, all his violence, all his betrayals had been for nothing. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses reliable, the justice inevitable, but cornered animals were unpredictable. Webb swung his pistol toward the chief, desperation overriding common sense. If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. What happened next moved faster than thought. Ayanna threw himself between the gun and his father despite his wound. The pistol fired, and 50 Apache warriors reached for their weapons in perfect unison. But the shot went wild because Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher who just wanted to help a thirsty man, had tackled Marshall Webb from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground in a tangle of dust and rage. The dust settled like a curtain, falling on the final act of a play. Webb lay motionless beneath Tobias, his pistol thrown clear by the impact. Deputy Bradley and his men quickly secured both Webb and Hawkins while the Apache warriors slowly lowered their weapons. But it was what happened next that would stay with Tobias for the rest of his life. The chief walked slowly to where Tobias sat, catching his breath in the dirt. The old man's weathered face showed no expression as he studied this white rancher who had risked everything for a stranger. Then, without warning, he placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders and spoke in Apache. Words that carried the weight of ceremony, of honor, of recognition. Ayana translated, his voice thick with emotion. He says you are now brother to our people. What you did today, showing mercy to an enemy, risking your life for truth, choosing courage over fear, these are the actions of a true warrior. Tobias felt something shift in his chest, like a door, opening to let in light he'd never seen before. All his life he'd been taught that natives were savages, enemies, obstacles to civilization. But looking into the chief's ancient eyes, he saw only wisdom, dignity, and a kind of respect he'd never earned from his own people. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Tobias had ever witnessed. The Apache warriors dismounted and formed a circle around him. One by one, they approached and touched his hand, not a handshake in the white man's fashion, but something deeper, a recognition of kinship that transcended skin color or culture. When the last warrior had paid his respects, the chief presented Tobias with a gift that took his breath away. A war lance decorated with eagle feathers and intricate beadwork, its shaft worn smooth by generations of hands. This belonged to my grandfather, the chief explained, and his grandfather before him. It has never been carried by anyone not born Apache until today. As the sun set over the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Apache prepared to depart. Ayana's wound had been properly treated by the tribal medicine man, and though he was still weak, he would live to see the peace treaty expanded and the real conspirators brought to justice. Before mounting his horse, Ayana clasped Tobias's hand. One final time, you saved more than my life today, brother. You saved the peace between our peoples. I just gave a thirsty man some water, Tobias replied. Sometimes, Ayana smiled. That's how the world changes, one cup of water at a time. 24 hours later, exactly as the story had promised, they were gone. But they left behind something precious, proof that in a world full of hatred and fear, simple human decency could still work miracles. Webb and Hawkins were tried and convicted of treason, corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. The gun-running operation was dismantled, and the peace treaty was not only renewed but expanded to include all the tribes of the territory. And Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher who had shown mercy to a stranger, became the first white man in territorial history to be formally adopted into the Apache Nation, because sometimes, in the brutal landscape of the Old West, the greatest battles weren't won with guns or violence, but with something far more powerful: the courage to see enemies as human beings and the wisdom to choose compassion over fear.